Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's Notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil for yet another engaging conversation.
Welcome to this deep dive. We're aiming to take a focused look at some key sources today, really trying to give you valuable insights without, all the usual information overload.
That's the goal. Cut through the noise a bit.
Exactly. And today we're diving into President Donald Trump's negotiation philosophy, specifically how it's laid out in his book, The Art of the Deal.
Right, and not just the book in isolation, but how that philosophy seems to be influencing his approach to governing right now.
Especially thinking about these early months of his second term, say January through April 2025, we'll be looking closely at the Ukraine conflict and also the administration's tariff policies.
And we should probably pull in some context from his first term, too, 2017 to 2021, just to see the patterns.
Good point. So for our listener, the learner, the idea here is to offer a quick, but hopefully pretty thorough understanding of how the current presidency seems to operate. Maybe find some surprising connections, those aha moments.
It really starts with that book, doesn't it? The Art of the Deal. It's kind of amazing how relevant a book from, 1987 still feels.
1987, yeah. Co-authored with Tony Schwartz.
And it's interesting because it's not just a business book. It's part memoir, too.
Detailing his big real estate deals back in the 80s in New York. Trump Tower, the Grand Hyatt, that kind of thing.
And doing that really cemented his public image, didn't it, as this master negotiator?
It definitely shaped that persona.
Yeah.
And you can sort of feel the influences behind it, right? His father, Fred Trump, that whole aggressive New York business scene.
Oh, absolutely. It paints a picture of a very confrontational environment. And the core ideas, the tactics laid out in the book, they really jump out when you look at his actions later on.
Okay, so let's maybe walk through some of those key principles with the first big one.
Well, think big is probably the most famous. It's not just about ambition. It's about, total focus on a massive goal.
I will be thinking anyway. Might as well think big. Is that the quote?
That's the one. It sets the scale right from the start.
And to achieve something big, you need leverage. That another key principle?
Huge. The book stresses using your strengths, exploiting your opponent's weaknesses, and crucially, never, ever seeming desperate.
The worst thing you can do in a deal is seem desperate. It's about maintaining that control, that upper hand.
Right. Which ties into the next point. Get the word out. This is about using publicity, almost weaponizing it.
Using bravado, playing to people's fantasies, that sounds familiar.
The book says the final key is bravado. I play to people's fantasies. It suggests even bad press can be good press sometimes.
Keeps you in the spotlight. And once you have that attention,
Then you fight back hard. Resist pressure, never back down, counterpunch when you're challenged.
the book actually says his general attitude is to fight back very hard.
Yes, it's quite explicit. A very assertive, almost combative posture in negotiations.
And underpinning all that is the willingness to just walk away.
That's presented as absolutely critical for leverage. You have to be genuinely prepared to kill the deal or at least make the other side believe you are.
Okay, and setting the stage.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't there something about starting high?
Anchoring high. Making extreme initial demands. The idea is to shift the whole negotiation range in your favor from the very beginning.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
But it's not all cold calculation, is it? There's something about instinct, too.
There is, yeah. Always listen to your gut no matter how good it sounds on paper. That's another piece of advice in there, a strong reliance on personal intuition.
So beyond these specific tactics, there's a kind of psychological game being played.
Definitely. Unpredictability is a big part of it. Keep your counterparts off balance, unsure of your next move.
The disruptor role, creating uncertainty for them.
Right. It can make them more reactive, maybe more willing to make concessions just to reduce that uncertainty. Though, of course, it makes building long-term trust difficult.
And we have to mention hyperbole. Truthful hyperbole, as he called it.
Yes, using exaggeration for promotion, for impact. It's a key part of the communication style described.
Though critics would call it manipulative, maybe linked to misstatements over the years.
That's the criticism, yes. And it connects to another technique, repetition.
Just saying something over and over until people start to believe it.
Essentially, yes. It taps into what psychologists call the illusory truth effect. We saw this quite a bit during the first term. Claims repeated so often, they got that bottomless Pinocchio rating.
And pulling all these threads together, the common theme seems to be control.
A very strong drive to dominate the process, manage the information flow, maintain that top-down leadership style, the controller.
Which might explain the preference for bilateral deals over multilateral ones. Easier to control.
That seems to be the logic, yes. Maintain maximum control over the negotiation and the outcome.
How does this stack up against, say, classic negotiation theory? Like getting to yes.
Oh, it's quite different. Getting to yes is all about mutual gain, objective criteria, separating the people from the problem.
Whereas this approach seems more zero-sum, focused on winning.
Very much so. It often personalizes the conflict. Know your adversary seems less about understanding interests for mutual benefit and more about finding weaknesses to exploit. Integrative bargaining isn't really part of this playbook.
And compared to standard leadership theories, transformational versus transactional?
It leans heavily transactional. Policy as deals, relationships as exchanges, based on leverage. Not so much about shared vision or empowerment.
Some analyses have called it expansionistic. Low cognitive complexity, high need for power, mistrust.
That's one framework used to describe it, yes. Characterized by a strong power drive, distrust, maybe seeing things in simpler, more black and white terms. Others just called it chaotic or a random walk presidency during the first term.
Suggesting it's not just the book, but also temperament playing a role.
Absolutely. And if you look through the lens of game theory, tariffs are a good example.
How so? Like the prisoner's dilemma.
Exactly. Imposing tariffs risks retaliation, potentially making everyone worse off. Even if one side hopes to force a better deal, a new Nash equilibrium.
But the risk is that both sides just keep retaliating.
Right. And the focus often seems to be more on the political game appearing tough, making a credible commitment rather than long-term economic stability.
So, translating this art of the deal philosophy into actual governance, the White House becomes the negotiation table.
It certainly seems that way. Governing itself starts to look like a series of transactions.
Policy decisions framed as deals with winners and losers.
Yeah, and complex issues often get simplified, perhaps to fit that win-loss narrative. You see that preference for bilateral talks again, where leverage feels more direct.
And demanding maximum returns from allies, applying a sort of cost-benefit analysis to relationships.
That transactional approach seems quite consistent, yes.
What about the internal dynamics? How does this affect how the administration itself works?
Well, there appears to be a strong emphasis on loyalty, sometimes seemingly over specific expertise.
Which some have called ungoverning, potentially weakening the administrative state.
That's a concern that's been raised, and alongside that, the use of spectacle of media, especially social media, becomes really central.
Back to get the word out, shaping the narrative directly.
Exactly. Circumventing traditional media, engaging the base, projecting that image of strength. The performer role is key here.
And that desire for control we talked about, it translates to a very top-down leadership style in government.
It seems so. Centralizing decisions, minimizing bureaucratic hurdles, perhaps pushing the boundaries of executive power.
Which raises questions about checks and balances, naturally.
And then in policy implementation, you see that disruption and bluffing again, challenging norms, resisting existing structures.
Keeping everyone guessing. We saw a lot of rapid initiatives early this year in 2025.
Yes, that can create disorientation. And using executive actions that test legal limit.
Is this disruption just a tactic or something deeper? Maybe tied to ideologies that see crisis as necessary for change? America first, demanding a break from the old ways.
That's a really important question. It could be seen not just as a tactic, but as a deliberate effort to dismantle existing structures to build something new.
But that carries risks, doesn't it? Weakening administrative capacity, creating instability, undermining partnerships.
Huge risks. There's a real tension between potential short-term gains from deal-making and the need for stability and expertise for effective long-term governance.
Okay, let's apply this framework to a specific case. The Ukraine conflict seems like a prime example of this transactional diplomacy in action.
It really does. The use of aid as a bargaining chip is particularly stark. We saw it in 2019, and it looks like we're seeing it again now in 2025.
Remind us about 2019. That was withholding military aid to pressure Zelensky.
Correct. Around $400 million in aid was held up, reportedly linked to demands for investigations into the Bidens and the 2016 election. That led to the quid pro quo allegations and ultimately impeachment.
And now, early 2025, we see something similar. An aid freeze.
Yes, an executive order in January froze all foreign humanitarian aid for 90 days. Ukraine was significantly impacted.
Then there was that reportedly tense Oval Office meeting with President Zelensky in late February.
Right. And shortly after that, in early March, military aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine were suspended.
And that suspension was explicitly linked to What exactly?
Reports indicate it was tied to getting Ukraine to agree to ceasefire negotiations and also potentially linked to a minerals agreement.
A minerals deal
Yeah.
within Ukraine.
Yes. And interestingly, the aid and intelligence sharing reportedly resumed only after Zelensky agreed to the U.S. proposed ceasefire on March 11th.
Even though Russia then rejected that ceasefire proposal.
Correct. And the pressure regarding that minerals deal reportedly continued even after the ceasefire agreement. It highlights a very direct quid pro quo approach.
Using essential security aid as leverage for policy and potentially economic goals, it seems like a deliberate application of the art of the deal leverage principle.
The pattern is quite consistent, and the rhetoric surrounding it is also revealing.
We've heard President Trump suggest Ukraine might have started the war, which is contradicted by the evidence.
Yes, and he labeled Zelensky a dictator without elections, though that was apparently retracted later.
After their meeting, there were comments about Zelensky being disrespectful, unappreciative, maybe just wanting an aid gravy train.
Those accusations were made, yes. Along with dismissing Ukraine's requests for specific weapons like Patriot missiles and suggestions Ukraine was risking World War III.
How does this rhetoric fit the art of the deal playbook?
Well, attacking Zelensky aligns with fight back. Promoting himself as a peacemaker fits get the word out and bravado. And undermining Zelensky could be seen as denigrating your competition to perhaps justify direct talks with Putin.
Kind of reshaping the diplomatic field to favor a U.S.-Russia dialogue?
That appears to be a potential goal, yes, bypassing Kyiv to some extent.
So let's trace the 2025 timeline again. January, aid freeze. Late February, Trump-Zelensky meeting focused on ceasefire and minerals. Then, direct calls between Trump and Putin.
Then early March, suspension of military aid and intelligence to Ukraine, coinciding with the U.S. presenting its ceasefire plan.
Mid-March, Zelensky agrees, aid intel resumes temporarily. But then Russia rejects the plan.
Right. And then Vice President Vance calls the U.S. plan flawed, which is an interesting pivot. And all the while, that pressure on the minerals deal continues.
Linking peace directly to a minerals deal feels very transactional, focused on financial outcomes.
It certainly highlights that aspect. What's also notable is the apparent lack of a clear strategy after Russia said no. Did they protect the downside, as the book advises?
It seems the focus was heavily on getting that initial ceasefire agreement, maybe without fully mapping out the next steps if Russia didn't play ball.
That's how it appears, a very intense focus on the immediate deal.
What's the general assessment from foreign policy experts on how this 2025 Ukraine approach has worked out so far?
Largely critical. The main objective, a lasting ceasefire, obviously wasn't achieved because Russia rejected it. The tactics seem to have alienated Ukraine, damaged trust.
And allies, what are they saying?
Allies, especially in Europe, have expressed alarm about the unilateral approach, the lack of consultation. There's concern it might have inadvertently benefited Russia by dividing the West and legitimizing direct U.S.-Russia talks over Ukraine's head.
And the minerals deal adds another layer of controversy. Ethical concerns.
Yes, questions about exploitation have been raised, so the consequences look like increased instability, damage to U.S. credibility, and potential domestic political issues, too.
So maybe a tactical win in getting Zelensky to agree initially?
But at a potentially high strategic price in terms of relationships and overall stability.
Okay, let's shift gears to the other case study, tariffs. This is a big feature of the first term, and it's back in a big way in 2025.
Absolutely. Tariffs really embody several art of the deal principles, demanding reciprocity, protectionism under America First, and using economic pressure as leverage.
The argument being that trade deficits mean the U.S. is being taken advantage of.
That's the core justification often given. Tariffs are framed as a tool to force other countries to change their practices, protect U.S. industries, bring back jobs.
Even the national security argument for steel and aluminum tariffs, which was widely questioned,
still fits the pattern of using whatever rationale is available to justify the leverage attempt. It's very confrontational, very transactional.
And in the first term, we saw tariffs on solar panels, washing machines, steel, aluminum globally, then the big ones on China.
Which led to significant retaliation from China, the EU, Canada, Mexico, often hitting U.S. agriculture hard.
What were the economic results generally thought to be?
Most analyses suggested negative impacts. Higher costs for U.S. businesses and consumers, job losses in industries using imported goods, reduced exports, increased uncertainty. The overall trade deficit didn't really shrink.
The costs were mostly paid domestically, and alliances were strained.
That was the consensus, yes. And now, in 2025, the approach seems even more sweeping.
The Universal Baseline Tariff Plan that was announced early on January 22nd.
Yes, an executive order calling for a plan for a 10% tariff on basically all imports. The rationale was, again, reciprocity and leverage.
But the reaction was pretty swift and negative. Markets down, condemnation from business groups.
Very much so. Widespread predictions of inflation, job losses, supply chain chaos.
Then the USTR came out with a plan in February. Phased implementation.
A phased 10% tariff, possibly higher rates for China, but the projections remained grim. Potential hits to GDP, wages, hundreds of thousands of jobs lost, maybe $1,500 extra cost per household.
And that's before other countries retaliate, which they've said they will.
Exactly. And the implementation steps seem to be moving forward in March and April, despite these concerns.
So continued uncertainty, maybe companies trying to import before the tariffs hit, more strain on alliances, even bipartisan concern here at home.
It really feels like a major escalation from the first term, seemingly ignoring a lot of the economic consensus based on that experience.
What do economists generally make of this broad tariff strategy, both then and now?
The consensus among economists and trade analysts is overwhelmingly negative. The first-term tariffs didn't achieve the big stated goals like cutting the deficit or broadly boosting manufacturing.
And the costs fell mainly on the U.S.
Yes, higher prices, harm to exporters, plus it damaged the global trading system, the rules-based order. The 2025 plan looks even more radical in that sense.
Did the leverage aspect actually work much?
There were some limited successes claimed, like maybe aspects of the USMCA or the Phase 1 China deal, but the strategic costs often seem higher. Friction with allies was constant, and some deals didn't last or achieve much.
And the uncertainty hurts investment.
Definitely. So while it might play well politically with the base and generate headlines, the economic assessment is largely that it's counterproductive.
Okay, so if we evaluate the outcomes overall, Ukraine, tariffs, we see these tactical maneuvers, maybe even tactical wins sometimes.
But they often seem to come with significant strategic costs.
Right. In Ukraine, getting Zelensky's agreement was maybe tactical, but Russia rejecting it and the damaged relationships are strategic losses.
And with tariffs, maybe some specific concessions were won or promises kept to the base. But the net economic costs, the failure to really shift the deficit, the strained alliances, undermining the global system, those look like strategic losses. The 2025 plan seemed poised to magnify those losses.
It feels like the focus on the immediate deal overshadows the bigger picture, the whole ecosystem.
That seems to be a recurring pattern, yes.
And how does this play out domestically versus internationally? Different reactions.
Very different. Domestically, the tough negotiator stance, the America First message, clearly resonates with his supporters. Simple narratives can be powerful politics.
But internationally?
Mostly negative. Alarm, confusion, resentment. Allies feel pressured, undervalued. Trust erodes. Cooperation becomes harder. Adversaries might see openings.
So the tactics optimized for a specific negotiation or a domestic audience can actually harm the long-term trust needed for global challenges.
That appears to be the risk. It weakens multilateral institutions and damages the perception of U.S. leadership.
So wrapping this up, the art of the deal does seem to offer a pretty coherent framework for understanding the president's approach. Leverage, unpredictability, hyperbole, transactionalism.
The coherence is there, yes, but coherence doesn't automatically mean it's viable or effective governance.
Especially when applied to complex global issues or long-term domestic policy.
Exactly. The focus on zero-sum, bilateral short-term gains seems ill-suited for the cooperative long-term nature of so much of governance and international relations.
We see the shortcomings in Ukraine, the failed ceasefire, the damaged relationships, and with tariffs, the economic costs, the strained partnerships.
And other aspects, too. The hyperbole potentially eroding trust over time. The emphasis on loyalty, perhaps weakening institutions.
So using the art of the deal as a governance model seems problematic.
Right.
Business tactics don't always translate well to the presidency.
It appears that way. Presidential leadership arguably requires navigating complex systems, fostering collaboration, building enduring relationships based on norms, and trust things that pure deal-making might sideline or even undermine.
What are the potential long-term consequences if this approach continues for U.S. influence, alliances?
Well, the transactional approach could continue to erode U.S. influence and trust. Allies might increasingly look for alternatives, potentially leading to a more fragmented, less stable world. Adversaries might feel emboldened.
And domestically, for norms and institutions.
The emphasis on loyalty, the use of executive power, the attacks on independent institutions, the rhetoric blurring fact and hyperbole, These could further weaken constitutional checks and balances, increase polarization, and erode faith in democratic processes.
So applying this model consistently carries pretty significant risks, both globally and at home.
It seems tactical victories could come at the expense of strategic stability, economic well-being, and democratic resilience in the long run. The consequences could be quite transformative for America's place in the world and its own domestic landscape.
Okay, so just to summarize our deep dive, the art of the deal gives us a clear lens on President Trump's approach, but applying it to governance, especially looking at Ukraine and tariffs now in 2025, raises some really serious questions about its effectiveness and long-term costs.
It provides a framework, but the results in practice seem mixed at best and potentially quite damaging strategically.
Hopefully this exploration has offered some useful connections and a deeper perspective beyond the day-to-day headlines for our listener.
And perhaps leaves us with a final thought to consider. Given these strategic costs we've discussed, what adjustments, if any, might be needed in this approach to ensure America's long-term prosperity and global stability?
That's the crucial question, isn't it? Finding that balance between deal-making and the kind of sustainable, trust-based governance needed for the long haul. Lots to think about there.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.